Alrighty. Hey guys, so this video will serve as a review for period 1. Obviously I'm going to focus on the kind of material that is available on the AP Euro curriculum document, the CED, and it behooves you to read over it. But I'm going to try and give a quick overview, I don't know how long quick is, we'll see, of many of the big concepts, talk about what I think is like basically imperative that you know. Broad trends with a little detail intermixed without trying to get too extraneous or tangential. And my message is largely that you shouldn't go crazy about individual detail, and we'll talk here. So we're talking 1450 to 1648. So for a little contextualization, obviously we'll also talk about the late Middle Ages. We'll look at really the three major crises of the 14th century, the 100 Years' War, the Black Death, and the crisis in the papacy. We'll lead into Renaissance, whether that be the origins of some of the ideas like humanism, secularism, individualism, the role of the printing press, judging art a little bit, and comparing Italian and Northern Renaissance. The Age of Exploration, so means, opportunity, and motives for doing so in the era, pre-17th century. And then, of course, the Scientific Revolution as well. Other big topics, and again, you'll note that these aren't perfectly in order because they're kind of handled more by topic than by time. The new monarchies, the creation of nation states as really a new entity in this time period in a few states. We'll talk about that. The Reformation, obviously the first major challenge to the church in many, many years. That fundamentally changes the network of European affairs and social classes, everything. We'll talk about that. And the probably inevitable series of wars that come up afterward. And the end of that in 1648 with the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia. Okay. So in the late Middle Ages, so we're talking really the 14th century to really contextualize how we get to Renaissance. We have a number of factors. So there are environmental factors as to why this happens. Couple of factors lead to a decreased number of people on Earth. Little Ice Age, in which there's a period of a certain amount of time, it's not particularly relevant for you to understand, that reduces the amount of crops that are available, and so fewer people survive. In addition, we have the Black Death, which we don't have great information on, but somewhere between about 1347 and 1350, somewhere between about a third and half of Europe dies from bubonic plague. It is deeply disparate. It depends on where you are in Europe, how much that affects you, or would affect someone, but enormous consequences. Essentially, because of these two events, there are far fewer people, and there are, weirdly, economic ramifications that are positive for a lot of people, in that now workers have more of a ability to kind of dictate the terms of employment and, more importantly, of wages. And so wages go up. So we have more people with more access to, what we would be close to calling a middle-class lifestyle. The 100 Years' War, which was, ended in 1453 after 116 years. It's really a series of wars between England and France. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter the events of the war so much for our purposes, but what really matters is it solidifies France and England as nation states, and the formation of these states helps to lead to the end of feudalism in Western Europe, that the old feudal model of like a manorial system where there is a lord or vassal in charge of serfs and peasants, and then a very decentralized system under a monarchy is kind of going to go out the window. And there's going to be a much more direct control by a monarch in the way that we kind of look at most of Europe for the majority of the AP Euro curriculum. There's also the emphasis on technological advancement is obvious in the war as well as the crossbow and some other developments are there. But the big one is nation-state formation, and we'll get to that with the new monarchies. Also, the Great Western Schism in the 14th century, and that's another term for the crisis in the papacy, in which the legitimacy of the Pope becomes a bit suspect when, for a while, there are 2 popes, and then at one point even 3. So basically, there are competing forces for control of the Roman Catholic Church, one in its ancestral home and current home in Rome, and another in Avignon in southern France. It's called the Babylonian Captivity, in reference to a biblical event. But if you ever hear that term, that's what it's for. Also, the message with this is the church is claiming to be really the vicar of Christ on earth, right? Speaking for Catholicism and Christianity as a whole, and yet you have 2 different men who are competing, who are displaying some of the worst habits of the papal leadership at the time, excommunicating each other's followers, and so all of these things add up to a people who are have more access to goods because there are fewer people and they have higher wages. Nation states that are forming, breaking down the feudal era, and also breaking down the Catholic Church's authority then, because, of course, in the feudal era, the Catholic Church kind of acted as a super monarchy above those states because the Western states really weren't capable of doing anything significant without them. And also the challenge of the Western Schism is quite significant in that it, for some, certainly doesn't invalidate the church in the eyes of most people, but maybe plays a role in the ability for the shift to more political states than necessarily a religious super monarchy, essentially. All of this leads to really what we see around 1400 in Italy, a little later in other parts of Europe, the Renaissance. So the Italian city-states are quite wealthy. They trade in the, some of them are quite wealthy, Venice in particular. They trade in the Mediterranean and then ultimately have a good trading relationship with the Ottoman Empire. They have a connection to the goods that are coming in from the East, spices, and other luxury goods. Now, these are not goods for the most people, but merchants start to get valued and start to sell things of great value and become wealthy. So we have a merchant class, and then what we would later call like a bourgeoisie sort of class, although that is not the term to use in the Renaissance. With that came like the arrival of an interest in education and really an outpouring of support for classical revival. So looking back to Greece and Rome for their literature and art and, perspective on things, which is interesting because, of course, it's a break from the Middle Age era of, church dominance. Because, of course, Greeks and Romans at the end were, but Greeks and Romans, for the most part, all these writings that we're talking about are non-Christian. They're pagan works. It leads to this development of humanism, if there is a term to know, to associate anything with the Renaissance. Humanism is that term. Humanism means basically, assigning value to the worldly things on earth and not believing that everything has a biblical message and that you're super tied to religion. It is secular in its outlook, but it is certainly not anti-religious. Almost everyone, basically everyone at the time who is a humanist, like Petrarch or Castiglione or whomever you want to read about, is also Catholic. The printing press, starting in around the middle of the 15th century, provides access to more reading material for more people, particularly cheap reading material. I kind of mentioned individualism and secularism as concepts that have risen already. Civic and Christian humanism, the application of that humanist principle to government, like we see, for example, in The Prince by Machiavelli, or by Christians Erasmus does this in the Netherlands, Christian humanism, applying those same principles to the actions of the Catholic Church. The Renaissance man was a man who was supposed to be, educated not just in literature and art, but also in values. Was a well-rounded person, had certain values that were important. Women are generally left out of this Renaissance, and so are most people. It's a Renaissance for a small group of wealthy white men. But women are generally left out of the process, although a few of them are educated. It is absolutely the exception rather than the rule. So to compare the two, I think generally is not as important as maybe is depicted in certain places if you're looking for information. But in general, we're talking about a movement that is either like deeply elite and deeply tied to this civic humanism, the political sphere of things, versus the Northern Renaissance, which is much more about like modern life, like what an average everyday person's life is like, and that is depicted in the art of the time as well. Whereas Italian Renaissance painters like Michelangelo or Da Vinci are often painting like Greek or Roman or religious themes in the Catholic tradition. In the Northern Renaissance, Peter Bruegel or the Elder or the Younger or Van Eyck or Rembrandt, they're painting regular people doing regular things. Now, regular people, they're probably very wealthy people. No one else is really able to be a patron of the arts at that point in time. But they're regular people. They're not all painting Madonna with Child or Venus on a half shell like you pretty much see in much of the Italian Renaissance art. And here are some of those examples. Obviously, I don't think it's super important that you memorize a bunch of art pieces, but be able to have an example, for example, of Italian Renaissance art, like Venus de Milo or Brunelleschi's Duomo in Florence, or the creation of Adam as part of the Sistine Chapel in the Italian Renaissance, or in the Northern Renaissance, the Arnolfini portrait, or I think this is a Bruegel, Hieronymus Bosch here, the Garden of Earthly Delights. We have different features here. We see differences in portrayal and color, and most importantly in most obviously in subject material. These are just two people. These are just a bunch of people living on a street. This is Peter getting the keys to the biblical kingdom as a biblical scene. This is a mythological scene with Venus, and so on and so forth. Don't get too hung up on the artistic movements, but important to understand. The Age of Exploration really had as its context the Crusades, Renaissance, and the Scientific Revolution. So the Crusades kind of inspired some of this explorative mindset in a lot of Western Europe, although I think that might be overblown. I mean, the Crusades really end a couple hundred years before this begins. The Renaissance leads to some more connections with the rest of the world. It's really tied into general economic growth, and that's really important. And then the Scientific Revolution, we see more technological developments that allow the Age of Exploration to happen. So there are any number of people involved. I don't think that's a particularly important, but I think causes are oversimplified in many regards, but God, Gold, and Glory is probably a good way to summarize a lot of the messages here. So basically, the idea being religious conversion. The Pope is even involved in this. He draws a line down the middle of the world, he thinks is the middle of the New World, the Treaty of Tordesillas, and says, Portugal, you get this side, and Spain, you get the other. And their only request basically is to Christianize those kingdoms. And so conversion matters. Gold is probably the most significant one. And by that, we don't just mean literal gold, and though it was very important, particularly in that mercantilist model, but wealth in general. And glory. We'll talk about the new monarchies, but this was an opportunity to kind of spread the message that you were great, and that your state was valuable and able to impose its will in certain ways. Effects of this, certainly, or I mentioned Causes include also like technological advances that make it possible, like the caravel, like the astrolabe, like better map making tools. The effects of this obviously are the Columbian Exchange, which is the transfer of diseases, food, plants, crops, people from the New World to the Old, and the Old World to the New. It causes all sorts of demographic changes. That's a very blasé way to put that 90-some% of Native Americans die as a result of the Columbian Exchange, largely due to diseases like smallpox and certainly many others. The Europeans are able to dominate the continent very, very easily and very quickly because natives die of disease in a way that fundamentally does not impact Europeans the same way. There's all sorts of rationales for why the same doesn't go the other way. It's getting too deep. If you're interested, read Gunstreams and Steel has a good explanation of a lot of that. Colonization takes place, so Spain and Portugal, and then later Britain, France, even the Netherlands start to set up colonies, right? As part of this mercantilist model, where basically a state is served by its colonies and needs to have a positive balance of trade, favorable balance of trade in which the goods coming into your country are of lesser value than the goods you are selling. And the best way to do that is to have colonies that have to trade only with you and bring in raw materials, and then you're able to produce finished goods. And this leads to trade wars. It leads to all sorts of conflict between European states. Scientific revolution. So, context. The medieval world was very deeply religious and dogmatic and theological. It did not really see science as an independent entity. Science was a branch of philosophy or theology. It was called natural philosophy for the longest time. Because science is not just thinking about stuff in nature. Science is what develops in the scientific revolution, which is using the scientific method, testing hypotheses, and coming up with conclusions based on observation and data. And that's really a 17th century phenomenon. For the most part. I mean, certainly not the only people to ever do it, but it's important. So what are the causes? Well, we have, again, printing press, hugely important development. The movable type printing press allows for far more people to be able to read, far more people to get access to written materials. The Reformation will challenge the Catholic Church, which allows for different states to have different entities, and it kind of diminishes the authority of the Catholic Church more generally, even in Catholic lands, in which the nation states are now able to maybe support scientific innovation because maybe they feel that it's, often feel like their scientific innovation is something that could be a benefit long term. The effects, of course, are a fundamentally new view of the world. It's going to spill over into the Enlightenment, and we'll talk about that. Deism and secularism is probably more a relationship with the Enlightenment, which is certainly a successor to the scientific revolution in many ways, but in a philosophical sense. And again, women are generally excluded from this, although not entirely. There are women involved in the scientific revolution, but because of all access to education and because of many social mores, that rarely is the case. So what are the developments of the scientific revolution? So astronomically, we replaced the geocentric model with the heliocentric model. So, Copernicus in 1543 publishes in Poland on his deathbed because he's afraid of the ramifications. I think it's called something along the lines of On the Revolutions of Heavenly Spheres, where he basically says, hey, based on my observations, it seems pretty clear that the Earth is not at the center of the universe, but that we revolve around the sun. Galileo really kind of establishes a proof of this in 1610 when he uses his telescope, data-driven empiricism. Empiricism being this concept meaning, making judgments based on data and based on information, which is just a fundamental point of the scientific revolution. I mean, as fundamental as it exists in science, is this idea that it's not about faith or about intuiting things. It's about what is right. What can we demonstrably prove over and over and over again? So Galileo proves this. There are other people involved. I think Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler are maybe getting a little too specific for our purposes. We see the development of physics and calculus. Newton is certainly basically the origin of much of what we would call modern physics. This guy who founds the field of like the laws of gravity, writes Principia, this enormously consequential mathematical book. He and Leibniz in Germany developed calculus independently at basically the same time. Calculus is fundamental to a lot of the math that goes forward, and much of the technological developments that are, we're enjoying today. Scientific method is developed. So again, I've kind of referenced that, but the scientific method is this practice of I have a hypothesis, let's test it, let's see what happens, and let's draw some conclusions by that. But also, let's just keep testing it, and whatever continues to be true is what we will assume is right. That's science. There's also the Descartes method, which is a much more philosophical, deductive reasoning. Don't need to get into that nearly as much. Anatomy, physiology, and biology, there are some developments as well. Like we have Harvey understanding the how blood flows in the body, that it's a closed circulatory system. Vesalius and others are important, and then Leeuwenhoek finds out about cells and things like that. The most likely person to show up in the AP Euro here would be Eugene Harvey. Eugene Harvey? Not Eugene. I forget his first name. Harvey. In somewhere in the 17th century. It's not Eugene. The new monarchies are a term very specifically for these new monarchies that are founded and nation states that are founded really in the 15th and 16th centuries. They are the foundation for the concept of a modern nation state, that there is an entity that has a monopoly of force in a given area, and they kind of unifies people of some similarities. Generally, they speak one language or multiple languages, but related languages often. Although we'll see that for the most part of the founding, they're very disparate languages. It kind of is this nascent sort of nationalism, although nationalism is not going to be a real driving factor until about 1800 in European history, for the most part. Western Europe establishes them. Really, we see England, France, and Spain kind of unify in different ways. England fights this War of the Roses. Ultimately, they unite under a Tudor dynasty. France consolidates power by mostly through the 100 Years' War and reducing the power of individual feudal lords and ultimately unifying under the Valois family. And then Spain unifies by marriage. So Ferdinand and Isabel are the respectively the monarchs of Castile and Aragon, these areas of modern day like Madrid and Barcelona and the hinterland around them. And then they seek to basically unify all of the Iberian Peninsula, engaging in what's called the Reconquista over a period of hundreds of years, but they are the biggest factor in it, in really establishing, by 1492, a Moorish-free, or mostly Moorish-free Iberian Peninsula. And it's when they start things like the Spanish Inquisition to try and root out Jews and Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula. This does not really happen in Eastern or Central Europe. Holy Roman Empire and Poland really remain deeply decentralized, and Russia is so far off the map at this point that it's barely much of a functioning state. Obviously, that won't stay. So why is this possible? Well, a military revolution in using things like gunpowder, and kind of referenced in the 100 Years' War, how the development of certain weapons would be important. Modern professional armies that are basically armies of a state rather than just nobles having their own like posse that shows up. Hugely important difference. Like whoever has the force is the entity that is able to have control. And rather than a monarch needing to like cultivate a consensus of nobles, that monarch can now just sick his army on people. They restructure political apparatuses, I guess. The political apparatus of multiple states by ending feudalism, creating bureaucracies that are able to impose, the dictates of a government. The importance, powers do shift here. So the power of the nobility will decline. Their special rights in taxation, the lands that they own, and their ability to have their own standing armies, like for an individual lord, this is kind of going to go away. And the new monarchies, the way again we see and believe in a nation state as a like fundamental concept of the last 500 years in Europe, is founded in this period. And if you see the term new monarchs or new monarchies, it means this period of time, these three states basically. The clergy's influence is going to decline. One of the huge trends from Renaissance through, say, the Treaty of Westphalia is not that the church isn't important, but that state interests are going to increasingly dominate over church interests in individual states. Though, of course, the state is still determining the religion of the subjects, it's going to be a long time before religious toleration is much of a thing. Really, 1598 in France is really the first time we see a large state with a significant religious toleration effort. I don't think the Peace of Augsburg really fits in there with that, and we'll talk about that. Bourgeoisie is a term that I probably shouldn't use this early, but merchant bankers become more important as banking becomes a more important industry with the development of more colonies, and so there is more of a dynamic economic system, although take that with a grain of salt because it is far, far short of what we'll see even in the origins of capitalism in the latter part of the 18th century, and certainly well short of what we see in the modern era. Also in this period, and fundamentally important to understanding it, is the Reformation. So the context of it is that we see increasingly centralized political states. The Northern Renaissance comes with Christian humanism. This idea that yes, certainly they're all Christian, but also that human beings have some value and importance on earth, and that maybe they shouldn't just be listening to some entity that is, very deeply, deeply human, and maybe not as legitimate as they like to claim they are in the papacy. And certainly corruption in the church is a huge factor in a lot of people's complaints about the Catholic Church and leading to the Reformation. Simony, this idea of buying your seat, so people would buy a bishopry, people would be absentees, so basically you would get a priest, get put in a position, collect his paycheck from the Catholic Church, but never actually show up to that church. Just didn't happen. Nepotism was often the reason someone's nephew gets put in that position. The multiple Medicis get made cardinal and pope. I think there was like a 13 or 12-year-old Medici pope at one point, cardinal at one point, and they consider that their greatest accomplishment because they bought the seat, basically. But ultimately, the straw that broke the camel's back will be the sale of indulgences by Johann Tetzel and others in Europe that Luther will fundamentally have a problem with, and so do many people. And that is one of the major reasons for the writing of his 95 Theses. But in addition to that, he also does a thing that was not forgivable by the Catholic Church, because there was not an expectation when Luther went through this that he was going to start a new religion. The expectation was that when he posts those 95 Theses on October 31st, 1517, that these are going to be up for debate. But ultimately, he criticizes some of the practices of the church, which could have been forgiven. Lots of people had problems with some things in the church, particularly the selling of indulgences. This idea that you could just buy your ticket to heaven or anyone else's ticket to heaven was crazy to him and to many people. But ultimately, it's his criticism of the validity of the Pope that is the most inexcusable as far as the Catholic Church is concerned. And so his 95 Theses kind of lay out like a critique of the Church, and then ultimately this snowballs into Lutheranism, in which he will embrace three concepts: sola scriptura, scripture alone; sola fide, faith alone; sola gratia, grace alone. So only scripture, meaning derive all of your practices from the scripture, which is why, for example, he will only believe in 2 of the 7 sacraments that the Catholic Church has, baptism and communion. Sola fide, that faith alone is enough, right? That good works, which is what the Catholic Church practices as one of the 2 things necessary to go to heaven, are not necessary to go to heaven, because it is by God's grace alone, in Luther's eyes, that people are saved, not by whatever you do on earth. And he will advocate for a priesthood of all believers, which is really the antithesis of having popes and priests. The idea of a pope or a priest is that they are interpreting the Bible for people. And Luther, while he certainly has perspective, thinks the idea of that sort of kind of organizational structure is not in accordance with the principles of the church, and that everyone should be reading the Bible and having a more direct connection to the material and to God. He is excommunicated. It leads to a number of enormously consequential events. One of the big ones would be the German Peasants' Revolt, which he writes a whole piece about them being murdering hordes, and he does not respect what they're doing. But there's a Peasants' Revolt that's tied into really grain revolts as well. And there's just a great deal of uncertainty in Europe at this point in time. There are other developments as well. So Zwingli and Calvin and Henry VIII are all second-generation reformers. Zwingli develops Anabaptism. Anabaptism is this idea of getting baptized as an adult, like when you can kind of really legitimately consent to it. Calvin will develop Calvinism, which will end up splitting into all these different sects, like Presbyterians, Huguenots in France, Puritans in England, but basically it is a more focused on predestination and more of a very, very clear expectation for how you're supposed to live your life. And then we have Henry VIII of England, who basically creates a Catholic Church 2.0 that he can control for political and personal reasons, like, of course, you know the story of him wanting to get divorced, having 6 wives, chopping the heads off of several of them. And that is the origin, really, of the Catholic Anglican Church, which will take on a much more Protestant nature after he leaves Earth. After he leaves, really just Earth. In response, the Catholic Church engages in what's called the Counter-Reformation or the Catholic Reformation. And they meet at the Council of Trent. It's like a decade-long, more than a decade maybe, meeting in which cardinals come together and they basically say, we want to change some of the so it's reformation of church practices, like end the corruption, buying offices, selling indulgences, priests not being educated or showing up to work, but it's a reaffirmation of the dogma and traditions of the church. It is by no means a capitulation to any of the religious questions that Luther had about the church. Also emphasizes the creation of religious orders, particularly the most important one being the Jesuits, founded by Ignatius Loyola, who were supposed to be a entity for education, and they found universities eventually all over the world. Many of the modern northeastern universities in the United States are Catholic, or any of the ones that are called Loyola in all different parts of the world. These are Jesuit colleges. They'll have a list of forbidden books. They support the Spanish Inquisition, which I described earlier. And there is also an emphasis on Baroque art. I think there on the left is Bernini's The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa of Avila, in which basically the message of Baroque art is just to shock and awe people into the majesty and greatness of the church. Emphasis on the mystic nature of it and the emotional response in a way that really isn't there in pre-Baroque Catholic, very conservative art patronage. Okay, all of this results, obviously, in enormous upheaval in Europe. And so there are a number of wars of religion. In France, we have the French Wars of Religion, which is essentially a French civil war, fought in a complicated way in what's called the War of the Three Henries, but Certainly, it's too much to remember Henry of Guise and Henry of Navarre and blah, blah, blah. But basically, it is Catholics versus Huguenots. Huguenots are a small persecuted minority, maybe making up 8 to 10% of the population of France, but almost half of the nobles of France, which is important. And so at the time, we have the Valois monarchy, where Henry the Third dies. Don't quote me on all these numbers always. Henry III of France dies, and his wife, Catherine de' Medici, really kind of acts as queen regent for her 3 sons, who are incompetent and dressed a little bit like Russian DJs. And so she is the one who will allow them to, will dictate the policy here of extreme repression of Huguenots. There was this famous event in 1572 known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, in which when Huguenots came from all over mostly noble Huguenots came from all over France to go to a wedding, she has 20,000 of them killed, not just in Paris, but also around the country. And then Henry IV is, I believe, Henry III of Navarre becomes Henry IV of France when he wins the War of the Three Henrys. He is actually Protestant and from Navarre, which is a region in the Pyrenees Mountains on the border between France and Spain. But he's Protestant, although he had been Catholic before that, and I think maybe Protestant before that. He is a opportunistic religious figure, not someone who I believe had particularly significant beliefs in certain things. And so when he takes over, he says, or maybe apocryphally says, Paris is worth a mass. But essentially, what the meaning is he converts to Catholicism because he doesn't think that he can rule France as a Protestant monarch over a population of 9-1 Catholics, or 10-1 Catholics. And so this is kind of the origin of this idea of politique a little bit. Now, again, I told you that the general trend is moving from, and this is what I'm describing as politique, the idea of going from religious interests to personal or political interests of an individual state, national interests above those of the religious interests. And he issues one of the most famous documents in European history in 1598, known as the Edict of Nantes, in which he grants limited Huguenot toleration. Basically, Huguenots can practice their religion, their Calvinist Protestant religion, in basically the areas in which they are already in. They can't proselytize and try and spread their religion. There are a lot of restriction on it, but it is really a limited amount of, and I say limited, but it's really a remarkable development because it's not common in the era of religious toleration. And this will be the case until 1685 when Louis XIV issues the Edict of Fontainebleau and says everyone has to be Catholic again. The last war of religion is the 30 Years' War, fought between 1618 and 1648, 30 years. The predecessor to the developments here is the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. Basically, as a result of some smaller scale developments, the Holy Roman Empire states basically said the term is whoever rules his religion. It's in Latin. I'm not going to butcher it. So basically, the principality, the prince in charge of that individual area, and there are over 300 of them in the Holy Roman Empire in this time. It's a deeply decentralized place. German particularism is the term generally associated with this idea that Germany is not very likely in any time soon, and it will take until 1871 to unify as a cohesive unit. And basically, each individual prince could choose whether their state was Catholic or Protestant. This is not religious toleration because it's not as if you could be a Protestant in a Catholic state or a Catholic in a Protestant state. This threatens, to some extent, Habsburg dominance, but, they've been saying that for hundreds of years, and then Habsburgs will be in power in Austria until the end of World War I. So take that with a grain of salt. It's the last major war of religion, and really it starts local and religious and kind of shifts into being more continental and political. And that is the trend. That is the trend in Europe, and that is the trend of the war. The Treaty of Westphalia does a few things. It allows Calvinism and adds that to the Peace of Augsburg, essentially. So there's a third option. Provides for the freedom of private worship, which is a huge development. It is the end of religious warfare. I mean, not to say that religion won't play a role in war to begin with, but it's the last major religious war in the aftermath of the Reformation. And more than anything, it's the beginning of this idea that there should be a balance of power in Europe between all of the quote-unquote powers of Europe. That without that, there is potentially very, very large-scale wars that can take place in a very populated continent with lots of different nationalities and languages and now religions, that with this religious pluralism and political nation-states that are forming and being more solidified without the unity of the Middle Ages and the Catholic Church, balance of power is going to be really important. It's going to really come up again at the Congress of Vienna and will be deeply important as a concept there. And so there's really a power shift as a result of the end of the 30 Years' War too, which is why the period ends in 1648, because it really represents a turning point in many ways. So some of the winners are the Protestant states of Sweden and the Netherlands. You may notice that those two are, going to be very significant for about 100 years, and then Sweden is kind of almost immediately gone. I mean, they win some of the wars, but with the death of Gustavus Adolphus, there are not necessarily competent leaders later on. Queen Christina is potentially mentally ill and has some problems, and the Netherlands is extremely economically successful for a long time, but won't be the global player that, say, England will end up being, although that's not clear that that's going to happen yet. France is a political winner. The Habsburgs are theoretically weakened, but again, they're still going to be very, very successful for a long time. But basically, the Habsburgs kind of break up. Charles V had kind of initiated this, where there's the Spanish Habsburgs and then the Austrian Habsburgs, and so there isn't this unifying Catholic entity. Spain is really in decline here. Spain was one of the dominant forces in the 16th century and before, but Spain is in the beginning of a long-scale decline that's going to continue up through, I guess the nail in the coffin will be the Napoleonic Wars. We'll get to that. The Holy Roman Empire has an emperor, but it is, the running joke is, it's not holy nor Roman nor an empire. It's basically true. But certainly Germany is where the whole war is fought. It has huge consequences. There are areas with 30, 40, 50% of the people are dead. It'll take a long time for Germany to be a major player in the world because of that German particularism that I mentioned. But when it does, Germany will be a huge force once it's unified in 1871. And so that is period one, from 1450 plus context to 1648. Tried to cover a lot of the major trends here, major ideas, and by no means is this comprehensive, by no means does this talk about everything, and by no means does that mean if you're studying for an AP Euro exam that you should ignore anything I didn't say, but hopefully this served as some sort of a rational answer to what do I need to know in period one. So if this is helpful, hopefully you will watch the period 2, 3, and 4 videos that I am going to make when it is not like past midnight on a Friday, and I'll see you guys next time.